originally, was where I came out of, was retail. But as is often the case, many, many years ago, I fell into payroll. I fell into working on a payroll project for a large retailer who said, can you help us out on a payroll project? And of course, I made that mistake of going, oh, how hard can it be? I'm sure I can do that. It's just a magic button. That's all it is, isn't it? But that was many years ago, and I have since learned just how hard payroll is. So I've got lots of experience of working with lots of different clients across kind of UK and global, supporting on their payroll journey. So that's a bit about me. Chris, I hand over to you, Chris Kay.
Yep, thanks, Simon. So Chris Kirby, I've been at Lace for 3 years as of this week. My background is payroll, you'll be pleased to know, hopefully. I did about 15 years or so in operations across administrator roles all the way up to global lead, global head of payroll roles. And I've been contracting or consulting now for almost a decade, doing all of the weird and wonderful stuff to help that magic button do its job.
Thanks, Chris. Patricia?
Hi there. Thank you very much for having me on the panel. My name's Patricia Davis. I'm the Payroll and Benefits Business Partner at the Capital Group. I've been with the organisation for 22 years in July, and I'm going on holiday to Jamaica later on.
Nice. Like that.
How are you, Patricia? Nice. Nice. Thanks, Patricia. And Lara?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lara Smart. I am a consulting director for LSC Group, and I've been doing this nearly 20 years, specialising mainly in global transformation programmes.
Lovely. And one of the things that we learned about Lara in the green room, wonderful guests, is that her favourite colour is yellow. So by a complete fluke, we've coded her up in lace yellow today. You happy with that, Lara?
Love it. Love it. And I'm going to South France next weekend.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Bring me back some wine, will you? Right. Shall we get into the nub of today's webinar, Simon?
Yeah.
Transition us into the next slide. So what we've got listed there is just, as you can see, we've done the introductions. Thank you to everyone who's joined us in the chat and told us where you're going on holiday. We've got some great places: Portugal, South Africa, Corfu, Thailand, Jamaica, as Patricia said. But let's get into the nub of it. And we've got five sort of questions that we've got up. We've got a few polls, and we're going to have a few panel discussions as well. For the panel discussions, I'm going to hand across to the fabulous Simon Puryear so that he can compare and control this wonderful rabble of payroll professionals that you've got today.
Right.
But the first thing that we thought we'd do, because this shouldn't be a Zoom really without having some sort of poll, I thought. So what we want to do is we want to get a bit of audience participation, and we'll start with our first poll today, which is, you know, the nub of the question. So hopefully you guys are seeing this on screen, which is, why do people think that payroll has a magic button? Can you all just confirm that, so I'm not just showing something that a functionality doesn't work, that it is actually coming up? It is.
Yeah,
Success.
the results are
Technology
coming
is
in.
working. Results are coming in. Why do people think that payroll has a magic button? This is going to be really interesting. And what I will do is, if you can all see, can everyone see the actual results coming in?
Yeah, no, it's interesting to see.
Hopefully the audience can see them as well, because this is going to form an interesting debate point for Simon and Chris and Lara and Patricia to get to the nub of.
Yeah, I think we'll share I think that for everyone on the call, you can't sort of see the results coming in, but once we end it, you'll see the results basically.
Yes, indeed. Okay, that's about a minute. So we'll end the poll, but we've had, just as a reiterator for the rest of you wonderful people, we've had 48 people that have responded, and 52% have said lack of payroll understanding. 6% have said not bothered, and I have no interest in payroll. Why are they? Oh, interesting. We've had 15% that have said lack of visibility within the business, and we've had 27% who have said, how hard can it be? My pay magically arrives. Simon, pick the bones out of that one.
Well, I think it's interesting seeing the results in terms of, you know, lack of payroll understanding. I think this is what we always say, and it's to a degree what I said in terms of when I first started on a payroll project. I think it is this danger that people think it is as simple as pressing a button. You know, that's the biggest challenge with payroll. I think we see that all the time, that people think it is just pressing a button. So I'm not surprised that that's the first result we're seeing. And what we're going to try and do really through today is just try and sort of talk around how it is so much more than a magic button, but how we can really think about how we elevate the world of payroll, and emphasize the whole complexity and everything else that surrounds it, and hopefully think about how we can try and do more of that, because I think we all have a part to play in this, almost, of trying to educate people, because as much as it frustrates us, the reality is a lot of people are always going to think it's a magic button, and that's through from employees who just get their pay, and as we said there as one of the options about magically receive their pay, but all through, also through senior stakeholders. That's how we often find when we're working with people, that senior stakeholders often again think of it as, well, it's just simple, and there's lots of people working in the background to make it that simple. But Patricia, I think you can relate to that, can't you, in terms of all the effort and all the work that's going in, that you and the team are doing to kind of ensure that from people's perspective, payroll works and they all get paid.
Yes, absolutely, Simon. I can relate to that. But I would also say, we could turn it around and say the fact that people think it's a magic button, it works well. So, we can kind of spin it. Do we want people to think, oh, it magically arrives? It means that we're doing our jobs well, doesn't it? We all know that no one's really interested in payroll until it goes wrong. So sometimes I kind of think that idea of having that magic button is actually not such a bad thing. But
it's like the swan. It's the swan, isn't it? In terms of the swan's there frantically paddling under the water, whereas it looks very seamless to everyone else who sees it.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with that.
Lara, what about your experiences then from a magic button, and why people often refer to it as a magic button?
I think Patricia makes a really good point. I think the external facade of payroll to employees, are they bothered about how people get paid? Probably not. I think internally there is a lot to do. I can see that Carla's just asked a question around how we raise the profile of payroll so that people appreciate the work that goes into it. I think that lends very much to the results of people not understanding it. So how do we make sure that we market payroll internally? We can do that through metrics. We can do that through short, snappy slides. We can do it through stakeholder relationship building. There's multiple aspects to elevating what your team do, not just from a have we hit 99% accuracy this month, but what about the innovation of those KPIs and SLAs, the query management, the projects that the teams are working on? I think encompassing all of those different aspects builds the bigger picture that you can present back. Just a one pager, I think, is enough. I think that people drown in a lot of words. I think that busy people don't have time to really read the detail on stuff. So sometimes just a summary slide is just a nice picture. Be consistent with it. So make sure that you do it monthly. Make sure that you're pushing it out to the wider audience. They will soon come to get used to learning that, and you've got the relationship, so you've got the trust there.
Yeah. And Chris, Kay, what about when you if you go back to your kind of Barclays days, I guess you were very much in that position where everyone just thought it magically happened in the background.
100%. And I think, like Patricia said, there's an angle that you have to remain conscious of, which is actually that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means you're doing your job well. But fundamentally, I think payroll is something that maybe employees haven't traditionally, and maybe still don't see the nuts and bolts of. They don't need to see that, because payroll do such a strong job, whether it's processes, technology, all that good stuff. And I think when you compare it to something like a simple action like changing your address, that's something that employees engage with HR or payroll, whatever, very frequently, and it's therefore quite prominent. It's in their minds, and they almost have an appreciation for what goes on. Whereas for payroll, all of that complexity that sits upstream, whether it's the master data back to the addresses and things, whether it's the personal information that feeds payroll, all the feeds from other systems and everything, employees don't necessarily see that as payroll. They don't see it feeding payroll. And it's an incredibly complex thing, but it's almost naturally hidden by the process itself. And therefore, I think when we look at those responses, I've noted down here, it was lack of understanding, I think, and how hard can it be? Ultimately, because it is hidden, people kind of interact with their organization in the way that they need to interact, which is with potentially the HCM tool, with their HR teams, all of that good stuff. And their payslip just arrives. So whereas there's this front end interaction that isn't necessarily seen as payroll, and then the only interaction they do get is their payslip, that is, it's fairly easy to jump to why people just see it as a magic thing that just happens on the end.
And what about that? The point there around the lack of visibility. I mean, I think Lara, you sort of touched on some of the ways you can try and make it more visible within the business, and there's probably this balance between almost whether you want it to be really visible or not. But actually, when you're looking to try and get investment and more focus around payroll, actually you do need people to realize just how complex it is. So you touched on some of those areas where you thought you could kind of help try and increase that visibility, but what are your thoughts specifically around how you kind of get it visible in the right way, I suppose, within the business?
I think there's also a question of why wouldn't you make it transparent? Because you're paying people, you're there not only to provide a service, but you're there to make sure that the business is compliant. So I think it's in everybody's best interests, both business and employee as well, that there is transparency around it. I do think that providing the right value add sort of statistics, rather than going into huge amounts of detail, is also key to making sure you can project that transparency and that visibility. And I also think that cumulatively, if you're assessing your payroll strategy on an annual basis, they're the metrics that you should be looking at to assess, where have I got trends, where have I got issues against what the market is doing, as to what do we need to do to improve, to innovate, to make, kind of take payroll to that next level, as opposed to, we talk about it not being very visible and transparent at the moment. And there's things that we can do internally, there's things that vendors can do to support us with that. But I also think that there's things that we can do to elevate the profession to where it needs to be, and the industry, as opposed to it still being referred to sometimes as a payroll processing administrative type function. And I think it's on all of us in the industry, especially within the leadership role, to make sure that we provide that visibility back to people.
Yeah, no, totally. And you must see that a lot through the work you're doing with the CIPP, I guess, in terms of trying to, raise that profile and get more visibility around it. I mean, I always joke about it being the wheels on the bus, don't I? I mean, the two Chris's will get bored of me talking about this, but I always say about it's like the wheels on the bus, and then whilst they're going round and round, people aren't worried about it. But once it's a puncture or a wheel falls off, then actually all of a sudden everyone's interested. But of course, then it's too late. Actually, then they've suddenly realized they've got a problem and they have to react very quickly. And I think that's the constant frustration, is actually you want people to take it seriously and actually be investing in continually improving on its day-to-day operation.
It's a cultural point as well, isn't it? Because if you make it transparent, if you make it visible, then you're putting the right roles, not people, but the right roles accountable for when things like that happen. If you do an RCA, a root cause analysis on it, you've got to be able to have the right culture in a company to adopt that sort of transparent mindset. None of the blame game, none of that. It's got to be an open partnership with the business, with the vendors, to be able to move and shift to that. So it's a cultural piece within the industry and within the business that houses payroll itself as well.
Yeah. I think payroll themselves can help influence that from a cultural perspective, in the sense of the culture that we're operating in ourselves. So I think a lot of what you said, Lara, I mean, you used the word innovate earlier, which is a fantastic point, and I'd add to that the word proactive, and that's the difference. I think if we're working in a world where, okay, it's easy to just transact and to just serve and to just do the job behind that magic button and make sure everyone's paid accurately on time. When I say it's easy, the job isn't easy, but it's easy to just focus on that. actually, if you layer that with being proactive and actually going out to the business, going out to employees with, potentially different services offerings from payroll, there's a lot about financial well-being and financial support, things like that at the moment. But also, as I think there's some comments in the chat around, don't fluff reporting to the business or to employees with just the usual. Keep it relevant, keep it punchy, keep it short, and also impactful. It has to be things that they're genuinely going to connect with and going to recognize the role payroll are playing. And I think that innovative point, back to that again, I mean, we even saw this week a fantastic idea in a client of ours where they're actually using QR codes. So rather than payroll just transacting, here's your pay slip, and then if there's a query, here's a phone number or an email address or a tool you can log a ticket for. Actually, here's a QR code that's next to the clocking machine. Go on your mobile device and load this up, and here's a video with our payroll manager actually explaining to you some of the common things that most of you ask all the time. I mean, that's
so
fantastic, and that's a really good.
That's really good employee experience as well, isn't it?
It is, and it's both proactive, it's innovative, and it's just changing the way that employees interact with and see payroll.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting, actually. And we've got a bit of a panel discussion. We're going to do a poll in about 5 minutes or so around op models, but we've got a bit around employee experience that we can, I think we can delve into. Patricia, I think it's worth us. We've sort of naturally flown into or sort of segued into our panel discussion, or the second discussion, which was around what can payroll do to overcome that perception that it's not just a magic button. So you guys have already touched on it a little bit more, but I think we should bring you in on some of this. There's some really interesting bits that have been said in the chat as well. Carl has just said, for example, should payroll sit with it? Should payroll be in its own function rather than sit within HR or finance? And again, maybe that's a perception piece, but do you want to give a few thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I saw that from Carla, and I think with a lot of the work that people like Lara are doing, we can eventually get to that sort of situation where payroll does sit by itself. And I often hear sort of various people saying that payroll needs a seat at the table. We need to be just as important as finance and HR. But going on to some of the things about how we can change that mindset. I think I had a list of things here, and Lara's mentioned most of them on there. Sort of let's educate and communicate with our employees. Just let them know that there are a lot of legal requirements that we're surrounded by tax regulations. You've got overseas employees. And sort of the real intricacies of calculating salaries. So, and regular communication. And as somebody said, specific, not fluffy, and to the point, that can kind of demystify the process and probably, elevate it a bit more.
I think it's interesting as well, because we talk always about the broader payroll operating model, don't we? In terms of, it can be, the danger is that people think of it very much as just that one almost element of payroll, and not the consideration of all aspects. We talk about bad data in, bad data out from an overall payroll perspective, but actually you can't do payroll without time information and without policy information, and whatever it might be. How you have to think of it from a much wider, broader perspective to ensure all aspects are considered, and therefore that hopefully that when there's more education around just what's involved to ensure that payroll is run, it hopefully helps sort of shift that perception within an organization. Is that fair, Lara?
Yeah, the payroll it's an entire ecosystem. So whilst we can quite rightly get pigeonholed in, what's our payroll software, what sort of, technology and integrations are we using? But the wider ecosystem is really important to understand, because where payroll is the end point of multiple receiving layers of data and information, it could feed from a benefit system, it could feed from a T&A system, it could feed from multiples of those solutions, and mapping that eco-structure so commission systems, finance systems, making sure that you understand what solutions connect to your payroll, or indeed if they don't connect via an integration, where your data is coming from into payroll. Because Payroll needs order and it needs accuracy. And that's where that being able to process your payroll consistently on time every month, it's not, I might be a little bit controversial here. It's let's use a stereotypical example of a finance department. You know, everybody knows, you know, for example, what finance does. It's going to get its accounts in at month end. It's going to pull data sources from different places to do that. Payroll doesn't just do that from the wider ecosystem and the solution architecture. It's also dealing with feeds from line managers, from employees, from query management. So there's a lot more variable and emotive data collection involved in how it's trying to get the data to. So there's a huge piece around the ecosystem of how that data, how those facts, how that information, and I think we all know you sometimes have to read between the grey lines of some of the data that you also get as well. It just needs to be accurate, approved, so that payroll can then get it processed.
Yeah.
I think on top of that, you know, you mentioned emotive there, Lara, right? It's the human element, isn't it? Because comparing the two, and you know, finance is incredibly important to every organization. Of course it is, right? It couldn't operate, you know, without that. But I think when you look at the role that finance play, where it's, you know, the figures ultimately come in, they're balanced, and they you know, we move forward as long as they do balance. Actually, when you're looking at the same data set for payroll, you have to factor the human element as well. It's not just a number on a page. That's potentially someone not being able to pay their mortgage, potentially someone who's not going to get this benefit if you don't do something different than maybe what the technology's done, or a broken process or something like that. And that's, I think, the intricacies within payroll that I don't necessarily think are understood, you know, as well as they should be.
Yeah, it's the logical and the psychological almost, isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because I remember working with an organization many years ago where we actually did kind of map out all of that complexity, all of those different elements that had to be taken into account to just ensure that payroll ran on a weekly basis. And actually, when you started to show that to the organization, they were, you know, almost horrified that all of that happened. Yeah, because they had no idea, and that they were sort of senior stakeholders where payroll sort of sat within their function, but they just had no visibility of it. So I think that broader, you know, awareness of that operating model is so important, and probably segues nicely into our second poll, Mr. Howard, doesn't it?
Yes. Shall we go for it then? Right. So the second poll that we'd like everybody, some audience participation once again, which I'm just launching now. What are the main challenges with your payroll operating model? Is it systems and data integrations? Is it process definition and or adherence? Is it data accuracy and or visibility? Is it business complexity or team structures? And we're seeing already, I'll show it up on screen in a minute, but we've got quite an interesting balance between systems and data integrations.
All of them.
We've got all of them straight in there.
Yeah.
All of the above, all of the above. Just while we're waiting, so we'll let this poll run for another sort of 30 seconds or so. But Patricia, anything in there from your perspective that you would expect to see in terms of lots of people saying this is a challenge for us in our operating model, just as we're waiting?
Most definitely for us, it's systems and data integration. So we recently changed our HRIS system. So, you know, we're going through one or two stumbling blocks with that. You've got to have the right payroll system in place. You've got to have the right process, whether it be in-house, managed, you've got to make sure that that's in place. We're currently going through the process of working with LACE in reviewing our processes, because, you know, we're going through a really tough time with our provider, and so it's a case of not just blaming the provider. It's not always going to be their fault. We've got to look at ourselves, see what we're doing, and, you know, with the help of you guys at LACE, we can come out the other end with the right process. Our integrations, you know, work well, and then, you know, it's great for the rest of the team that we can then do more value add things instead of, you know, just concentrate on making sure that payroll is right, and dealing with the issues that we have.
Yeah, certainly. So Lara, we'll stick to ladies and guests first before I get the two gents to give their views. I think everyone should be able to see some of the results on screen. Anything that surprises you from what you're looking at in terms of what our audience have said?
The only surprise is that nobody said anything around team structures.
I thought
So
that.
yeah, I don't know if target operating model or people or training or skill set or resource kind of all encompasses that team structures perspective, you know, whether it's UK, whether geographically it's regionally, globally, shared service centres. So I'm quite surprised that there's nothing in there. Systems and data integrations is not a surprise. I see a common theme with a lot of my clients in that they will procure a system or a solution, and they will build what they need to. And there will be, as typical in vendor selection, your one-time costs, your recurring costs. And I think that most people will go for the big bang, we're going to implement, we're going to send it live, but then maintenance seems to fall off the radar. And I think this is where the systems and data integrations piece then comes as a challenge later on, because everybody's so focused on let's get everything live, whether it delivers the ROI or the compliance, you know, that should be monitored moving forwards. But I do think that there's a piece in there around how businesses are continuing to deliver their model and make sure that they're maintaining and keeping up with that sort of stuff, because you can save costs in payroll in different ways. And I think that if you put that sort of business case in front of somebody to say, we're saving this and we want to utilize the money to improve and maintain that, or indeed build it in as part of your target operating model to further deliver and maintain in sort of a project delivery ongoing capacity, there's really good ways of doing that. But for me, they're the main two that stand out. Business complexity, of course, mergers, acquisitions, all that sort of stuff that comes in as well.
Yeah. Mr. K, what do you reckon?
Again, the only surprise is really around team structures. You know, I think that I would have expected to see some at least in there, but certainly no surprise in, you know, system and integrations being one of the big ones. I think Lara makes a fantastic point around it's something that's very easy to do. You know, if it's say procurement led, if it's IT led, if it's led in a silo, wherever that is, even if it's just payroll led with no other sort of considerations, it's very easy to, you know, the dreaded MVP, to go down that route. It's very easy to just put something in based on what we do today being done somewhere else. I think one that often changes just through things like expansion and growth in businesses, but two, employees change, and employees are our customer, right? They are literally our customer. There's no one else that we serve in payroll. You know, obviously the authorities and things take receipts and files from us, but fundamentally we're there to serve employees, and their expectations, their demands, their needs change. I mean, certainly if the last 4 or 5 years has taught us anything, it's that nothing's a given in terms of society and global demands. And I think that has to be factored when you're making those decisions and when you're structuring your broader sort of especially technical model around the need for adaptation, around the need for evolution in line with your employees and anything else. I think the other point I'd raise around the systems in particular and integrations is another sort of common banana skin that we see and come across and have to sort of fix is the globalization approach, right? And most of our clients are global. A lot of them operate in, you know, 10, 20, 30, you know, countries. And one solution doesn't necessarily fit everywhere. And there has to be accountability and allowance for localization if you're going down that route. I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't go down the route of having a common solution, having as fewer integrations as you can. But if you do, there has to be account made, especially in payroll, for that localization approach, because as much as payroll fundamentally is the same stuff done quite differently, it is done differently in pretty much every location. And it's very hard to just do it with one solution.
Yeah. And I think I was just going to touch on the system one, because I think it always amazes me how, you know, there's a danger again from a payroll perspective. You think about it as the payroll system, but it's actually when you think of all of the other systems that feed in, you know, the example I'd use is like the time and attendance system. Again, You know, the number of times you find that, say, a different part of the business are going, well, we're off, you know, operationally, we need a time and attendance system. And I get why operationally you need the time and attendance system, certainly in, you know, retail's a great example, isn't it, where you need it, but actually you don't think about the impact that's going to have on payroll. And you've potentially got one part of the business off doing their own process of, well, I'm going to go and choose a new system and I'll choose what's right for me. And that's fine. Doesn't impact you, does it? And actually you're like, but it does.
It's the corporate governance within the business that I think drives some of that, doesn't it, in terms of what people are procuring locally versus globally, and how the culture has embedded the global, the regional, the local models, because that's business critical infrastructure. But there's got to be the right decision makers signing off on something like that, in my view.
Yeah, exactly. But the one we haven't, the one that is interesting is the business complexity one, because that's the sort of second most popular in the results there. And I think, I mean, it's quite I suppose a broad subject, isn't it, in terms of business complexity and what that actually means. But, you know, Patricia, I guess you see that a bit from a kind of how the business complexity for you within kind of Capital Group, how that can, you know, impact your day-to-day operation and what you're trying to achieve.
Yes, and I think you know, the way that we see it, you know, we don't necessarily see it as a very complex business, but you know, we've had people come in and review what we do, and you know, the level of maternities, and you know, we're financial services, so we have many sort of bonus structures, and you know, a lot of these things need a lot of manual intervention. And I think, you know, that's kind of what we want to work towards, to get a lot of these things automated, to make sure we're much more efficient. But yes, you know, overall, our systems are, or our, you know, our practice and our business is pretty complex. So yeah.
I mean, this is very much a passion of mine, as you know, Simon and Chris. But I think I always sort of split complexity into two buckets, and I think there's non-negotiable complexity, and then there's, you know, complexity that you can actually do something about. I think Lara mentioned around, you know, M&A, for example. Ultimately, a lot of businesses, and it's becoming more common, I think now, are M&A based, right? There's a lot of businesses that is how they operate. Now, that is non-negotiable. That means you need to have partners, systems, integration, whatever it is, processes, people in place to serve that as a fundamental requirement of your business. But there's also optional complexity that can be solved. And that's things like, actually, we've been operating on the same payroll system for 15 years. We've actually had 15 different policy drives in that time, and we've now got 400 different flavors of exactly the same thing built into our system. Well, you may need that for today, but can you do some form of harmonization as a business around even the policies, for example? And do the business understand that if they do that, it makes payroll far, I mean, cheap as one element, but also far less risky, and, you know, far more controlled. So I always try and think about it in those two buckets, because there are businesses that will always have complexity, but there is work that can be done to improve it.
Yeah, nail on the head, Chris. And where they don't integrate properly or harmonize, that's when payroll gets hit with the added T's and C's, complexity, all that sort of stuff. I tend to use the Moscow principle, so around the requirements, so must, should, could, won't, because I think it's simple enough for everybody just to understand, who's not native to the industry and some of the complexities. Do we absolutely need this versus do we not need it? Should we, could we stick it in future roadmap sort of thing? Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I'm conscious I better move on, otherwise I'll have Chris Howard telling me off in a minute that we're spending too long on this question.
Listeners, just so you know, he gets told off by chat, you know, passive aggressive, direct message chat. Come on, Simon, keep you to time.
So I was gonna go on to what Chris raised a really good point earlier about, you know, our customers in payroll and who our customers are. But I think the role that payroll plays to that overall employee experience is so important, Chris, but often gets, again, so overlooked. You know, people don't think the impact that payroll has on the employee experience.
No, 100%. I mean, employee experience, thankfully and rightfully, is playing a far more prominent role across organizations. And I think that's targeted. If you think about payroll in the ecosystem of HR or people and payroll, it's targeted a lot at the HR and the people side of things. But actually, as I said earlier, they're our customer, right? Everything we do should be pointed at, is this the best thing for the employee? Does this achieve the best outcome for our employees? And I think a lot of the siloed thinking, a lot of the MVP decisions, the easy route, some of the things that cause some of the challenges that we've already spoken about, and also that some of the poll results, illustrate. I think those are decisions that are made without that lens. They're made well, what's the word? They're kind of made internally around, people teams versus payroll teams versus finance team. What works best? How do we replicate what we do today? What's the cheapest option? What's the quickest option? That's not what we should be doing, right? Every decision we make should be driven by not just factor, driven by employee experience and how does this impact how we serve employees.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And Patricia, again, we talk about that a lot, don't we, with the work we're doing about, again, trying to come at it from an employee perspective and think about the impact employer. I appreciate in your workforce, to a degree, it's relatively straightforward, but you've still got quite a diverse workforce that need to be considered in all of this, haven't you?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've got to remember that, the employee experience, it impacts their financial security, their job satisfaction, and then it gives sort of overall engagement of employees in their other work. Because what we have to remember is, if we get payroll right, our customers, as Chris said, they can then focus on the job that they are employed to do. And so, I think we can come right back to square one, and let's let them think that there is a magic button so that they can focus on what they need to focus on, and then we can give them that financial security as much as we can, and get their engagement in their normal day-to-day work.
They don't let them think it's too much of a magic button. Lara, what do you reckon from an employee experience perspective, and what more can we do to try and kind of enhance that employee experience from payroll perspective?
When we're setting up projects and programs, providing they're being set up correctly, we should have design principles. So do you want it to be automated, more efficient? One of them should always be the employee experience lens. And somebody said last week that there's 126 variants of people. Now, I don't know what they are in details, right? But I think it's testament to how different every individual is and what their different preferences are and what they want.
You're not going to give us all 120 now, no?
126. No, like roll off a list afterwards. I think that in payroll, it's really easy to give somebody a payslip and you know that you're going to have the queries, and people think the payslip is it. Actually, if you're looking at your strategy and you're assessing the market, you're going to know that there's pay on demand, typically a room divider, but a really interesting offering to people from, an employee experience perspective. Salary sacrifice pensions, the benefits that go through payrolls, the benefits. And I also think that drives a personal value to everybody. So what are you using your benefit that you're paying tax on that goes through a payroll or pay on demand for to add value to your life? Not from a work perspective, but to you as an individual. If everything came from an employee focus rather than leadership and vertical siloed ways of working, rather than the kind of matrix horizontal practice that we want on that end-to-end process, I think that the right decisions would be made having the right business and employee interests in the first place. And so I think, just to loop back, I think when we're setting up programs and projects and we have those design principles, I think that everything that we do in payroll as part of your value statement, your mission, your purpose should encompass employee value, employee experience. Everything that you're doing should, as a business benefit, like in a business case, should always link back to that. Why are we doing it? The 5 whys, why should end up in some sort of experience factor as well.
Yeah, and as you say, how you can enhance that experience for the employee and make, it could be simple things about the information they're receiving, or it could be about how they're going to access their pay slips, or, whatever it might be. But absolutely to come at it from an employee perspective and ensure that you are enhancing and making it that much better for them. It does
Yeah, and
always
like Chris said earlier, like the QR codes as well, like what a nice
yeah.
Apparently you can get 5 generations in a workforce nowadays, and of course especially with Gen Z coming through, they've got different demands to somebody who's sort of on the sort of further along stage of their career. Everybody wants different things, so it's how do you target all of them and make sure that you can assess and address the whole population.
But the QR code one is a really great example as well, because as Chris said, they've done it in a fun way, because you do go to a YouTube video and it is done in a fun way, but actually it gets the message across, because ultimately it takes someone through their payslip, it goes through frequently asked questions, it's done in, as I say, in an engaging, interactive sort of way, but ultimately it's really reduced down the number of questions and queries they're getting around it. So I think it's brilliant. It's brilliant.
I think
like making payroll fun.
Exactly. We are fun.
But I think importantly, it does cover Lara's point as well, doesn't it? Because it's not done in place of the traditional routes; it's done in addition to, and therefore, the client we're talking about has a predominantly young workforce, and the majority of them therefore they love that, and it works, and it does remove a lot of queries. But actually, where they have people who still want to contact payroll in the old way or in a different way, that option is still open, and that's that employee focus. You don't just switch everything off because you found the magic bullet. You think, what do all of our employees need? How do we meet all of those requirements?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people will be stealing that one, Chris.
Well, I got the word magic bullet in as well as magic button. We need to come up with another one.
Bullet's a bit aggressive though, Chris, isn't it?
Sorry.
Like a double-edged sword, that one could be used in a different manner of
Shall we? I know we've got some questions coming in, but we will do questions in a minute. But I don't know, Chris, as we're sort of talking about the employee experience, it probably leads nicely into our last poll, doesn't it, around the kind of change piece?
I think so. Yes, I think so. So the question that we'd like you to once more, just for the third and final time, just to give us a little bit of audience participation. You've got to sing for your webinar supper here. Is why is the impact of payroll change often overlooked? So we've got 4 options, which is focus is often on the system rather than people. What is changing and is not understood. There is also, it is seen as unnecessary and until implementation, or there is no budget for change. So pop your bits in the chat, or sorry, not the chat, the poll, and we'll get our fabulous panel of 4 payroll gurus to pour over it. And just while we're waiting for that to crack on, any kind of thoughts? We'll start with you then, Chris, on this particular question before we then lead into it, just for maybe 20 seconds or so.
I think, I mean, I don't want to preempt the answers, but for everything that we've sort of been discussing today, I think the first one, focus often being on the system rather than the people. For me, that's if I look at the symptoms that a lot of our clients are facing, that's the root cause. I think that there's so many things beneath that, and there's so many different things that could have happened to maybe avoid those symptoms and things that could have been done better. But fundamentally, it comes down to we've not focused on how we're serving people. We're focusing on how, what system do we need? What's the best decision cost-wise or whatever? And I think the impact of payroll change is overlooked when you don't understand that the priority is your people. I think if you understand that as a fundamental design principle, as Lara said, I think from there, of course, you factor the impact of change. Of course, that's a key part of your delivery. If you're doing it as a very technical project or simply a payroll project, actually it might be bottom of the pile, and maybe even the people who are doing it don't necessarily have that as a second nature.
And Lara, just reflecting on some of those results which are on screen now, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I agree with Chris. I am of the view that transformations, it doesn't matter if you're making a small change in a system to a big, global ERP sort of scale of change. It ultimately impacts the people who work on it, the people who are involved in it, the end point of it. And I think that that's often forgotten because there's usually people making decisions who don't have the experience or the understanding And there's things we can do around that, right? But sometimes there are just people in positions who don't listen to perhaps payroll people who do have that understanding of the complexity and if things go wrong. And I think that goes a long way into people thinking that they can automate everything. There can be one source of truth. AI would be brilliant if it could do that, wouldn't it? The latest buzzwords that get thrown around. But the reality is you still need people to manage this process and will do for a long time. Can you flash the...
Yeah, of course.
Just... is seen as unnecessary until implementation. This is a big one. So I see this quite often, whether it's recalibrating and rebaselining programs, because people have gone straight into an implementation. They've procured something without necessarily understanding what they've got. So understanding your as is, your landscape. We touched earlier, Simon, on kind of the wider eco structure across the pillars of people, process, data, controls, all of it. Do you know what you've got? Do you know where you want to be as part of your strategy? And do you know what your gaps are before you go into implementation? Because that's going to set you up for success. And most businesses, I still see a gap there in what they're trying to do. And that's the important thing. If you're changing anything, make sure you understand before you do it, so you know what your gaps are going to be. And that also lends to helping you understand what's changing, because you can articulate it in the right way to people.
Patricia, anything from that? I'll pull the poll down in a second so that we can all see each other. But is there anything in there that surprised you? Or you're on mute. Mute, Claxon. I'm just pleased it's not me.
Right, there's always one. There's got to be one on every call. I think for me, sort of, it's not necessarily understanding, the change that's required. And organisations tend to focus on other priorities, don't they, when it comes to change. Payroll is often sort of at the bottom of the pile. So sorry, it's just disappeared again. Could you pop it up again there, Chris? Sorry. And yes, I totally agree with what Chris said earlier. That often you focus on the system rather than the people around it that are required to do the change. So yeah, it
sort of goes full circle, really, doesn't it, to the whole magic button piece again? Because I think people just think of it as, well, it's just that system in the middle, and they're pushing the magic button. So then if you're going to kind of change something, it's easy because you sort of take one out, put one in, kind of thing. That's it. And I think that's where, for me, it's always around, you either see it that people they think, well, we don't need to tell anyone until implementation, because then we just tell people the system changing, end of story sort of thing. And hand in hand with that, then there's no budget often allocated to these programs. Over the years, I worked on so many projects where people just think, well, I don't need to worry about the change aspect. But the fact that potentially everyone's pay slip is going to look different, the fact that the pay's the same, if it's shown in a slightly different way, people are naturally going to suddenly think, well, hang on, does that mean I'm getting more tax, or something's changed in the way this has been processed? So I find it amazing that people don't consider the impact it's going to have on every individual, not only the people that are administrating it and involved in it, but also those that are actually on the receiving end of it.
And I think we can loop it back as well to the conversation earlier around the profile of payroll and the importance of boosting that, because that second point around understanding the impact of change, or not understanding it, being one of the fundamental reasons. Again, if there's transparency around what payroll does, but not just what payroll is doing, how payroll is interacting with everybody else, and how payroll is, serving people both up and downstream, actually the changes are understood, because people automatically think, well, if this is changing, this must be changing, or we might need to change this, or we might need to do this. So there's that engagement point, and it starts with payroll playing that prominent proactive role and making sure that that's understood, but then it comes with the collaboration while enacting that change and while triggering that change.
And payroll it's let's be really clear, it's a compliant and it's a knowledge-based function. And if you're going to step into a transformation program, it's nothing like BAU. They're highly complex. They've got a lot of risk. They're typically quite big in scale. And whilst they're going to offer people the opportunity to enhance their skill set on learning, something like that, without the experience having done that before and the scale of the challenges that in front of them that can be quite daunting, I think that there is a piece there where you have to have a blend of transformation and BAU skill set to be able to help articulate some of that as well. Because quite often businesses will usually under-resource these types of projects, and then people will be like deers in the headlight wanting to get on with it, but not necessarily being able to navigate the complexity of something like that. And then it's a bad experience, again, coming back to the people, because they could be learning really good things, but you can't do that on your own if you've not experienced it before.
Yeah, I feel like we could have a whole separate webinar on the whole change piece. We could talk about this one for ages, because I think we're all passionate about it, and then all get equally frustrated about it. Chris, I'm conscious of with time, we've got quite a few questions I think that have come in. So do you want to just take us through some of the questions that we've had?
Yes, I'll do a bit of a round robin, but if anyone has any particular compunction to also say, oh, I'd like to answer that as well, we can do that. There's a couple which are kind of linked together. So we talked about, Carla mentioned earlier about does payroll need to sit outside of HR or finance? I'll start with you, Patricia, because we've also had a link to that is, should there be a chief payroll officer role that's more transparent at the C-suite level? What do you think?
I do think we are going in that direction. I'm not really convinced that payroll could or should stand on its own. I think it links very much with either finance or HR. My personal view is that it sits comfortably in HR. It is about the people. Finance it, and I think for me that's almost where the link ends. My experience is, I've worked with payroll in both HR and finance, and it's harder to get the information about the people if you're not sitting with those people, i.e. with the HR department. So yeah, that's my idea. That I really think I do personally think it should still connect, but it should have somebody sitting at the seat of the table and at the C-suite level. That's my view.
Lara?
I think it depends on the business. I don't think that there's a one size fits all approach for it. I think HR is people-based, it's people-based data. I think finance lends more to the reconciliation, to the controls. It can report into reward functions. I think it just completely depends on the target operating model, the appetite and the culture of the business, and where it's going to get the best leadership and deliver the best value. CPO is a role that I would like to see in the future, but I think that it needs some work to be able to get it there, to really establish this is what this role is responsible for.
Okay, brilliant. Chris or Simon, any kind of final bits before we move on to the next question?
I mean, I'm pleased it was framed as a final bit, because it's always the worst question to go last on because everyone's already said it. But I completely agree. Lara's hit the nail on the head with it. Essentially, it's horses for courses, right? What works for one organization won't be right for another. That goes for sitting in finance, sitting in HR, sitting in reward. It's the same. But fundamentally, I think the danger that people need to watch out for with that concept is you don't want another set of priorities added to a mix that's already complex and makes change, adaptation, transformation difficult, right? So if you're in that environment, it can be as simple as budget, right? If you've got a CHRO and a CPO, they've both got different budgets, they've both got different priorities. It's already hard to get change through the door when that factors payroll in any organization. And I think that's a really important factor in that concept. I'm behind it where you can make it work, but you need to make it work properly, not just add to an already complex landscape.
Cool. Simon, I've got a question which we'll go through. It's an anonymous one. How do global payroll needs of SMEs, I'm assuming that means small, medium enterprises rather than subject matter experts, how do the global payroll needs of SMEs differ to enterprises? Yeah, it does. Why are they undeserved by the main vendors?
So as in, why are they? So are we saying from a global perspective why it's not one global provider kind of fits all?
That's what the question's getting at. Yeah.
I mean, I think that again could be a whole separate webinar, I think. But I think there's this sort of myth, I suppose, that there is one size fits all to every global organization, and I think we found that isn't the case. I think you can potentially narrow down how you kind of service your global operation, but I think finding something that fits every business from a global perspective is impossible. I think largely, as we find, just because every country is different in its operation. It's culturally different, but then tax legislation and everything is different. So therefore, finding one solution that is going to be able to tick all those boxes is near on impossible. I think we're getting a lot further forward than we have over the years, but actually being able to find one specific solution is pretty impossible. I hope that answers the question. I think.
Yes, well, please let us know in the chat if that's answered the question. We've got literally 1 minute left, so apologies, but we have got a couple of questions in. What we'll try and do is answer those questions afterwards, before we, after this session is finished. What we'll do is we will feature this as an on-demand version on our website, so you can access that through the Lace Partners website. What I've just done is pulled up on screen just one final kind of section just to let you know that we do have a payroll community that we get together on a semi-regular basis just to discuss and debate some of these ideas, and we've been running that for a couple of years now. It's a collective of some really interesting people from a broad church of different industries. If you're interested in finding out more, then obviously there's some email addresses there. You can reach out to the guys. We have got 1 minute left, so I'm just going to stop the screen share for now. And I guess really more than anything else, Simon, we want to thank our guests for joining us today.
Yeah, no, it's been great. You start with an hour and you're like, oh, it seems like quite a long time to kind of fill to discuss it, and then you just get into it and it's like I could carry on for ages. But Patricia, Lara especially, as well as obviously the two Chris's, thank you so much for your time, your input, your insight. It's been brilliant. I love having you on, and it's been great. And as I say, we could have talked for ages, but thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Well done with the PowerPoint and the polls.
I know. Notice how Chris shared the last slide.
I feel like you had the harder job.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And that's it for today. Hopefully you've enjoyed the webinar. As I said, it is an on-demand version you can get on the Lace Partners website. If you go into the Insights section, you can find that, or it'll be on the events section as well. But from myself, Simon, Chris, Lara, and Patricia, thank you very much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.